Learning styles comes from the idea that people differ in the ways that they learn.
The idea came about really in the 1960s when people were looking at higher education, and they found that the major things that predicted attainment in primary and secondary education, things like intelligence and so on, particularly intelligence, didn't seem to work in universities, or they worked very poorly. And so people started to ask, well, why do some university students perform well and others don't?
From this emerged two separate themes. The first is known as the type approach,
which says that people are different types and therefore they need different ways of learning. And you can find all sorts of these. If you go into the literature, you'll find, well, there's one famous study that found 71 different types of learning style. And of course, they can't all be right by definition. But these are things like the classic one of, are you a visual and auditory or a kind of aesthetic, tactile sort of person? And if you are, then you should be taught differently or learn differently and so on. So that's saying we're different types.
The second theme asks why you are learning and how you are learning.
So it tried to look in detail at the mechanisms and processes by which people at university learn. And that one quite quickly found that when you ask people why they're at university, you get all sorts of different motivations for being there. Some do it because they were told to do it, they were made to do it. Others do it because they want to be successful. And a third group seems to do it mainly because they want to understand, they want to make sense of the world. And that latter group, interestingly, also often motivated by vocational drives. So they say, well, I wanted to become a doctor, therefore I needed to understand how the body works and that sort of stuff.
Differences in personality seem to play a big part.
Getting a deep theory of personality isn't really around, but we do know that personality, the current overwhelming theory is the big five: extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness to experience. We're not saying you're either extrovert or introvert. What these theories say is that there's a continuum. Most people tend to be in the middle. It's a normal distribution. Some people are more extrovert, some are more introvert. We're not saying there are two types of people. And there's an old psychological joke which we always tell here, which says that psychologists divide people into two types: those who divide people into two types and those who don't. And we're not dividing people into two types. These are continua theories. A deep learner is motivated by wanting to understand, and perhaps by vocational features. What they do is they try to understand the theories, they dig deep into the thing. That's really associated with being open to experience. You've got to like ideas and want to approach new ideas, and by being relatively extrovert. And extroversion's an interesting one there, but it seems if you take on unusual ideas, you've got to be extrovert enough to defend them. If instead you take on something like surface learning, now a surface learner is typically motivated by fear of failure. They're doing everything to avoid failing the course they're on. And their strategy then is simply to rote learn as much as possible and then forget it the moment the exam's over. And they tend to be typically low conscientiousness. And therefore they're not systematic in their study, not open to experience and so on. They're often also more neurotic. It's the anxiety of fear of failure which is also driving that strategy. Finally, you get this very strange one, which used to be called strategic. It's now called achieving, but they're the same thing. And they're motivated not by fear of failure, but by a desire to be best. They want to succeed. They want to beat the others. And then they adopt some very interesting strategies for learning, which is they pick and choose between the surface and deep ones. So where a theory is the most efficient, easiest way of working out how to understand something, they'll learn the theory. But if they can get by with just learning a few facts and rote learning them and regurgitating them in the exam, they'll do that as well. So that they're picking and choosing whatever gets them through the exams and so on as best they can. And the result is they're incredibly patchy in their knowledge. They'll know one thing really well, and you ask them something which you would have thought they'd also know, and they've got no idea because the exam system didn't pick that up. And those people are really driven, they're high in conscientiousness. They apply whatever they can to getting what they want to achieve. We did a study a while ago where we were comparing a traditional type of curriculum with problem-based learning. Now, in problem-based learning, what you do is you have to work together to achieve a common outcome. So you may get a dozen students all meeting one week, and for a fortnight they'll discuss and investigate a particular patient and that sort of thing. Interestingly, the deep learners like that. The surface learners hate it because they don't know what to learn, and the strategic and achieving learners, they dislike it because they don't see why they should give all the good answers to the other guys. So that you can see the three different sets of motivation are coming out very differently. Also, neurotics don't like it because it's very anxious, anxiety-provoking, sitting in a room with 12 other people and having to share your ideas. They might be wrong. And so the extroverts don't mind. The openness to experience guys, they're happy to throw in ideas into the pot. You can see that these two very different teaching systems are going to encourage different types of learners.
It's possible to move people between these systems. They're not fixed.
A good teacher can help somebody to move across to being a deep learner, or encourage them to be more strategic if being more strategic is what's needed. And we showed that in a longitudinal study. We looked at the learning styles of all the students entering medical school, and we looked again at their learning styles 6 years later when they were qualifying. And along the way, about half of them had done an intercalated degree in something. So they'd studied anatomy, physiology, psychology, or whatever in depth. And what you found was that we knew what they were like to start with. They'd changed to some extent, but the intercalated degree had made them more deep learning, less surface learning, but also to some extent more strategic. So it had given them skills to allow them to move into a different learning style. So I think as teachers, if we can just tell them, these are the things you need to know, and they will just learn it. But we can also say, well, why are those the things we need to know? What's the reason for thinking that matters? And in medicine, we can make them more strategic. And they need to be strategic in medicine some of the time. Because if you're at a cardiac arrest or something like that, that's no time to say, well, I wonder what the theory says about what we should do here. What you've got to do is say, I've got to do A, B, C, and all medics all have these lists of things you do in the right order in emergencies. But also, somebody needs to sit back and think, well, why didn't that patient survive? Or even while it's live and the action's hot, they've got to say, hang on, this isn't quite fitting the standard pattern. What's going on here?
Is there a best way of learning?
Pure surface learning is in general bad. And we've seen students, we've followed them through, the ones who fail sessional exams, if you follow them through to the end of that year, the ones who failed their exams become more surface learning, and the result is that they actually fail more. It's a maladaptive strategy. It's the natural thing to do, but as they say, if you're at the bottom of a hole, the thing to do is stop digging. And if they carry on digging on rote learning, they're going to do badly. So they've got to stop that maladaptive strategy. So in general, surface learning is mostly a bad thing. Deep learning is fine if you're trying to produce university professors. We're all deep learners. That's what we're trained to do, and that we produce other deep learners. Fine, as long as all you're trying to understand is theory and the way the world works. But actually, medicine is a practical discipline. And I suspect that strategic is, in some ways, the optimal sort of thing in medicine. At times, a little bit of theory will save a hell of a lot of rote learning. Once you've learned how to multiply two numbers, you can multiply any two numbers. And it saves learning what the product is of all the possible combinations of numbers, which is a hiding to nothing. So theory can be incredibly useful, but sometimes theories aren't very practical. And you've got to decide, and really for every situation you come across, you've got to say, what's the best thing to do here? Is it better just to learn, or is it better to have a theory? When you do learn to drive a car, you see the difference. Mirror, signal, maneuver. It's pushed hard into every new learner of driving a car. And that's surface learning. But actually, you still find yourself doing it 40 years later. The difference between these two different approaches is that the type theories are simply saying, what type of person are you? And they don't seem to work. Whereas if you really want to get at why your students differ, how they're differing, you need to actually ask exactly those questions. Why are you here? How do you like to learn? And then ask, are they the right approaches? And for a practical teacher, they're much more important than trying to say you're type 1, type 2, type 3, or whatever. So Why are they here? How are they learning? And those are the big questions, actually, for any teacher with any student.
Here are some questions that are intended to get you thinking about this subject in greater depth. To what extent do you agree with the views presented in this programme? Why do you think type theories are so popular, despite the fact that there's little evidence to support them? There's further discussion of problem-based learning in our e-learning module on small group teaching. Go to faculty.londondeanery.ac.uk/e-learning and select the topic from the left-hand panel. If you're a student on our postgraduate certificate course, you'll find references and suggestions for additional reading within the online resource folder.